morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Northwestern University Research Initiative for the Study of Russian Philosophy and Religious Thoughts interview series. My name is Peter Winsky, and I'm so very pleased and honored to be speaking today with the distinguished professor in great books at Pepperdine University, Paul J. Contino. Paul, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Peter. I'm well, thank you. And as I said to you before we started recording, it's so nice to see that, dare I say, iconic image of Bob Dylan looking cool as can be, circa 1966, I suspect, behind you. I think that will inspire me as his music is done over the decades, as well as your presence.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here. I'd like to give a brief introduction before we get started, and then we'll go into the interview, if that's okay with you. Okay, so Paul J. Contino is the distinguished professor in great books at Pepperdine University, as I mentioned. He received his Ph.D. in English literature from Notre Dame, after which he taught for 12 years at Christ College, the Honors College of Valparaiso University. He has served at Pepperdine since 2002 and has been twice granted their Howard A. White Award for Teaching Excellence. Along with his wife, Professor Mary Mullins, he has co-edited the journal Christianity and Literature. In 2001, he co-edited and introduced Bakhtin and Religion, A Feeling for Faith. He has published numerous essays on Fyodor Dostoevsky, as well as essays on Zhuangzi, Dante Alighieri, and Jane Austen, as well as a number of contemporary Catholic authors. His wonderful book, published in 2020, Dostoevsky's Incarnational Realism, Finding Christ Among the Karamazovs, will soon be published in Russian translation. And I'm going to post a link to the book down below in the subscription. And it is this book, Paul, I believe you have a copy with you if you'd like to show the cover. I can show it on my screen. There it is. This is really the reason why we are meeting here today, for a number of reasons. So welcome. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. And I'd like to just, and I'm going to share my screen here for a moment so that I can show everyone that you were recently invited to attend an audience with Pope Francis, at which you gave him a copy of your monograph. And so, actually in here I can just maybe, so it's a little bit closer and clearer, I can also show the cover of your book. But with this in mind, I'd like to ask you to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about the context of your visit and perhaps share some of your personal highlights about the trip?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was an extraordinary moment. And what made it more extraordinary is that Pope Francis twice referred to Dostoevsky in his remarks to us. Dostoevsky is one of his very favorite writers, and he cited Karamazov and Notes from Underground. What was the context? The context was a conference called The Global Aesthetics of the Catholic Imagination. And there were writers from, the United States, but also various countries in Europe, Africa. There were writers from India. It had been long in the planning. COVID interrupted. The spark was the synergy between Father Mark Bosco in Georgetown and Father Antonio Spadaro, who's the editor of Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit journal. And Father Spadaro is friends with Pope Francis. He was the one who interviewed Pope Francis when he was first elected Pope. He's a fellow Jesuit. Suffice it to say, we're in Rome. We're in the Villa Malta, where Civiltà Cattolica is published, this beautiful Roman building. I mean, it's just a city of endless beauty. And Pope Francis says, we invite you to Vatican, writers, distinguished writers. And there were some really distinguished writers. I'll mention some Americans. If our listeners don't know Alice McDermott, she's one of my very favorites. If I moved a little bit, you might see, well, you'd have to look at those. That's a shelf of Alice McDermott books. That's called Show and Tell, low tech style. Alice McDermott is a marvelous Catholic American writer of Irish American descent who I think has a beautiful religious vision. If I'd written about her, I'd written about Tobias Wolff, Andre Debus. And over the years, I've been part of this group that has put on conferences here in the States on the Catholic literary imagination. We've had conferences in Fordham, Loyola Chicago, most recently at University of Dallas. I'm probably leaving Notre Dame is coming up. So these folks got together. We put this conference with an international array of writers together. Other Americans, Christopher Beha, I don't know if you know that name. He's the editor of Harper's and a wonderful novelist who has returned to his Catholic faith. Phil Cly, a wonderful novelist, missionaries. Anyway, I can ramble on about the wonderful authors, but Pope Francis taught literature when he was young, and he loves literature. And he's, well, like his predecessors, Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II has evoked Dostoevsky in some of his remarks. You know, he wrote an apostolic letter about Dante a couple of years ago in the 700th anniversary of Dante, and that was being celebrated. So he's very attuned to literary matters. He said in interviews, I think we should read Dostoevsky again and again for his wisdom. So all of this kind of converges. And, you know, honestly, Peter, it felt like an experience of a lifetime. And I had, you know, resonated. I love Pope Francis. I resonate with his pastoral presence, his words. And I had written this book on Incarnational Realism, Finding Christ Among the Karamazovs. And I asked Cascade Press to write, to print an edition with an inscription. And when you saw that picture of me presenting the book, I wrote this: Dear Holy Father, Pope Francis, you have exhorted us to read and reread Dostoevsky due to his wisdom. This book is the fruit of many rereadings of and conversations about one of your favorite novels, The Brothers Karamazov. I offer to you in the spirit of fratelli tutti, brothers all, sisters all, and our shared hope for peace. Very aware, of course, of what's happening so terribly in Ukraine. May God bless and keep you always, Paul Contino. So, you know, I wrote that in Spanish. That's his native language. He's conversant in Italian. I practiced my Italian as I presented it to him. And then the second picture you showed, I remembered, of course, to shake his hand. And he's got the most beautiful smile and loving gaze, and it was a lovely moment. So that's the story. The conference had many highlights. Yeah, there it is. Somewhat chagrined. It was actually kind of a Dostoevskian moment, I dare say, because you see his bright smile, and I'm like, here I am practicing my Italian to present my book to you. Oh yes, I greet you, Holy Father. Thank you.
It's such a wonderful moment. It's such a beautiful image, and what a
yeah.
incredible inscription. A truly blessed experience for you.
So it was, you know, and I believe, again, like his predecessors, John Paul and Pope Benedict, and I have this great desire. I know you're Orthodox, Peter. If I looked at 2054, 1,000 years later, can we come together? Well, things ain't looking too good right now, but I think he shares that hope of that unity.
Sadly, no, but it's always something to pray for and to hope for, the peace in the world. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, so this sounds just so filling and joyful, that as you mentioned, the Dostoevsky moment, but also that hidden joy that we find in Dostoevsky is something that I hope we can kind of pull out and tease out. And hopefully this is the foundation for a couple of the questions that I'd like to ask you, if I may. And I have two specific questions based on the text that you had sent me of Pope Francis's speech that he gave. And I think, if it's okay, I don't know if this has been published officially.
It's totally legit to quote it. Yeah.
Wonderful. We can put it then also maybe perhaps on the forum, the initiative's website, so that, and I'm going to be a bit verbose in, again, the Dostoevskian spirit here with my questions. But so let me pose this to you. And the first is based on the following quote from Pope Francis. He says, You know quite well that artistic inspiration is not only consoling, but also disquieting, since it presents both the beautiful and the tragic realities of life. Art is the fertile terrain where the polar oppositions of reality can be expressed with a language that must be creative, flexible, and capable of serving as a vehicle for powerful messages and visions. For example, Dostoevsky tells us in the Brothers Karamazov how a little child, the son of a maidservant, throws a rock and hits the foot of one of the dogs of the master of the estate. The master then sets a pack of dogs on the child, who runs up and tries to save himself from their fury, but ends up being torn to pieces under the satisfied gaze of the master and the frantic eyes of the mother. That image has tremendous artistic and political force. It speaks to us of reality, past and present, of wars, conflicts within society, the selfishness within each of us. To quote just one poetic passage that challenges us, end quote. His Holiness says later that, quote, your work helps us to see Jesus, to heal our imagination of everything that disfigures his face or worse, attempts to domesticate it, end quote. So my question is, in relation to your work on Dostoevsky, can you explain for us what you believe Pope Francis means here about, quote, healing our imagination through art, literature, and scholarly work, particularly in the context of Dostoevsky and the horrors of the suffering of children as presented by Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov?
You know, I mean, I have to say, when I sat there, we had a copy. I have it here on the desk somewhere amidst my papers. We had a copy of the speech as he was presenting it in Italian. And I'll find it in a moment. Oh, here it is. I thought, wow, what a horrific image to evoke. I mean, here we are, we have a half hour with the Pope. We're meeting him. It's a formal occasion. There's about 60 or so people in the audience. I could send you a picture of the whole group with him.
Please.
Martin Scorsese was there too. I mean, hey, the filmmaker. Yeah, I could get into that in a moment because he's a bit Dostoevskian himself. Suffice it to say, I'm amazed. He brings this horrific image. And maybe Scorsese is apt at this point because his films have such horrific moments of violence. Right. And you think, did I really want to see that? I remember teaching Rebellion in class, and it may have been the last time I taught it, and I was reviewing those stories. I said, do I have to read this aloud? And some students said, please don't. I mean, it's just so bad. And that last one is maybe the worst of all. This is where Alyosha says, what should we do to such a man? Should he be shot? Shoot him. Ha! I see the devil on your little shoulder, Alyosha. Ivan has won. But one completely understands why Alyosha says that. My sense, Peter, is that example was given to us because behind all of the Dostoevsky references is the war in Ukraine, the images we all have of children being killed, hospitals being bombed, just really horrible, savage behaviors. Now, he's walking a thin line. He's been criticized in various ways for, walking that thin line that doesn't please people on one side or the other. But that was the background, and that's the reality. He wants us. He's not sentimental. He's very warm, but he's not sentimental. And this is why I think he highlighted the tragedy of war and that suffering that comes to children and to innocents in wars like the one we're seeing now, and that we saw in Iraq. I mean, Americans have seen this in their own experience. Afghanistan. I think, before I turn to Karamazov and how do we find the image of Jesus in all of this, because we do. Right. Well, maybe I should turn there first. I guess in the book that I wrote, I dealt with the suffering of Ilyusha, because that's, in a sense, how narratively Dostoevsky returns to the suffering of children question, which is so difficult in book 5. And and he knows resentment. He's a little boy. He's defended the honor of his father, and then he gets into that war with the children, the rock throwing. But Alyosha is the peacemaker. He brings them together, and he brings them together in such a way that, as Smirnov said, well, Alyosha really had nothing to do with it. We did it on our own. We made this reconciliation. But of course, he's behind the scenes, and there's here I'll use a phrase that actually George Patterson uses in a very fine essay. Is it possible to have a politics of humility? That's what Alyosha engages in there when he brings those boys together. And at the end, Ilyusha's suffering, holding Kolya, holding his father, bringing them together, Ilyusha becomes an image of Christ. I don't want to be sentimental, but there's a sense in which, and I think this runs through the novel, that the suffering that we experience as human beings can be seen as a participation in the suffering of Christ. This is language that's very common in Catholicism. It seems to be, I mean, you'd have to teach me more about Orthodox, but it's
so.
there. You know, I mean, how do we understand the cross? He visited our pain. He knows what, I mean, on the face of it, the cross looks like tragedy. Of course, the story, the Christian story, is one that is deeply, fully, finally comic. We have the resurrection, but the cross is our symbol. I happen to have a cross, but my wife gave me a nice present. I'll just show you because it brings the both together. Do I bring it on? You know, it's a St. Francis cross. It's the T, the Tau, which is the way he did the cross. But there's like an image of the risen Christ. It brings the horror and the joy together somehow, and that's what happens in the course of Book 10 and the epilogue. I mean, there's nothing worse than a father seeing his child suffer and die, as the hero sees Ilyusha, and yet at the end there's this theme of resurrection. There's this coming together of boys in peace. And it's interesting that Pope Francis chose the name Francis. No previous pope had, but it was Francis of Assisi who inspired him, and well, I'll stop there. I'm not sure. Why don't you ask me another question or pick up on something before I ramble along too much?
No, this is wonderful. This is perfect. I wanted to pick up briefly on your comment about Alyosha's being in the background, being behind the scenes, this engagement, because we often see readers of the novel, scholars, everyone, I think, struggle particularly when they read the forcefulness with which Dostoevsky presents the suffering of children, the rationality that is so tight, so impenetrable that Ivan presents, that even the hero of the novel succumbs to. He commits literary plagiarism twice in the text, right? First with the second with the kiss, right? No, first with the kiss. I apologize. First with the kiss, but then again after Zosima dies, and he's being led by Rakitin to Grushenka, and he says, "I don't accept God's world." Right. But I don't accept the world. This is the second moment of literary theft, and because there's no answer to it. What of a rational nature? We can't give a philosophical response. Dostoevsky can't just write a hagiography or something else that's going to give someone an answer to when a father or a mother sees their child suffering.
Right. And he's not going to give them a theodicy.
Right.
I tried, with the help of Terence Tilley and others. He has a new book, by the way, Terence Tilley, a fine new book on Karamazov. But he wrote a book called The Evils of Theodicy, that all too neat explanation of why God allows the innocent to suffer. I don't think that the encyclical by John Paul II on the salvific meaning of suffering does that in a glib way. I think it's more mystery than systematic logic. I mean, there's a place for philosophy. I love my colleagues in philosophy who grapple with these things, and writers who offer a philosophical response. That's needed. But finally, the artistic response is more what Pope Francis wants. He wants not the theoretical, but the tangible, the real, the incarnational, if you will.
Right.
And here is how Alyosha, in this humble way, inserts himself in the profound suffering of other people. And of course, he does this with his brothers, with their lovers. The other time he plagiarizes, of course, and actually two more times, with Grusinka, I've only given you an onion. You know, he uses, as Robin Foyer Miller says so beautifully, what's best in the other person to remind them of what's best in them. I've only given you an onion. That's her image. And he says to Dmitri, you know, and I do think he's going to escape to America. He'll come back to Russia, but I defend his escape. You remember that new man always. Right. And Dmitri, in ever good humor, says, we're talking like Jesuits now, aren't we? Right, Alyosha laughs. This is so apt because, of course, Francis is the first Jesuit priest. But Jesuit casuistry throughout the novel is critiqued as that very kind of rationalized way of getting yourself off the hook that you would think Dostoevsky would be critiquing to the very end, but he doesn't. Because at its best, everything cuts both ways in Dostoevsky. Casuistry looks at the particular person's situation, and that's what Alyosha does with Dmitri. I think that's what Pope Francis wants us to do with each other. You know, that's why it's kind of amazing. I mean, we were one audience. He does this all the time, but he has that way, like, I'll do it with you, looking into your eyes, you know, and you're there. You're a person before me, and that's what matters most. And he shakes hands. He doesn't want any of the kissing of the ring or anything. He just, the human touch. That's where Jesuit casuistry at its best attends carefully to the particular situation and personhood of the person to whom Alyosha is talking. And he becomes a master at this, you know, as Robin says, the kind of master spiritual therapist, one might say. And that's such an important image that, you know, really, I think, transcends even Dostoevsky's uglier pronouncements, especially in his nonfiction.
Yeah, this is such a wonderful answer, and it's such a beautiful way to approach Dostoevsky. And you've premeditated actually my question on the second discussion of Dostoevsky and Pope Francis's talk, where he speaks Notes from Underground.
Yeah, and you know what? I looked back at the first one, like I found it. This is what we got. Okay, that was added in the published comments, so they have so that was brought in. And what's so interesting, and I'll send you this article too, and you can cite it for the readers. Father Spadero has a very good essay on the literary influences on Pope Francis. And let me get my glasses. I might just read a little bit of this to you. I love tragic artists, Francis told me during a 2013 interview. And on a couple of occasions, I'll just read this aloud, I had the opportunity to continue the discussion with the pontiff, discussing this or that writer. One example is Dostoevsky. I knew that the great Russian novelist was among Bergoglio's most beloved writers. Bergoglio's, of course, that's Pope Francis's name, Jorge Bergoglio. He repeated this several times subsequently during the press conference on the flight back from Bahrain. I think that's when he said we should read Dostoevsky again and again for his wisdom. Which work does he particularly favor? The Brothers Karamazov, that's what I thought. I imagined this. It can be remembered that as Archbishop on the occasion of the canonization of the Raplatin martyrs on May 27th, 1988, Bergoglio quoted Karamazov. Whoever does not believe in God will not believe in God's people. That's, of course, Zosima. But when asked directly, what do you think of Dostoevsky? Or what do you like of Dostoevsky? Francis replied, Notes from Underground. Later in my 2016 interview, he described it as a jewel. So I had to go back to it this morning, because I think it was so painful. My initial or second reading or third reading of it that I put it aside. What a self-destructive folly this man from underground represents. But here's a little bit more of Bergoglio as to what he sees in that. The writer of the article, Antonio Spadero says, I want to dwell here on one aspect of this passion for tragedy. The fact that it testifies to the complexity and contradictory nature of human experience of life. Bergoglio loves tensions, polar opposites. As Romano Guardini, who was of great importance to Bergoglio when he was studying, he was working on a Ph.D. on Guardini. And here's a plug. If there's a listener out there who knows German, would you please translate Guardini's book on Dostoevsky so we non-German speaking readers can read that in its fullness? You know, his articles came out in places like Cross Currents in the 50s and 60s, but it's ripe for rediscovery. Okay, contradictions. The underground man does long for goodness, but his willful refusal to understand, to receive the embrace of lies, is tragic. I mean, it's a terribly tragic ending. And Francis wants people to remember human beings' capacity to, in their pride and their willfulness, just refuse the embrace that Christ offers, because that's the embrace of Christ right there. I paused, hoping maybe you want to ask me to clarify something, because I'm afraid I'm rattling on. And I was rereading it, Peter, this morning, and I was just so struck by how human and terribly flawed this human being was. After spending so much time with Karamazov, I see so much of what he does in Karamazov with people being so painfully, as Bakhtin calls it, the sideward glance, looking, how is somebody evaluating me here? And to the very end, the underground man is doing that, even when he's offered utter acceptance and validation. Yeah.
That image of the father in the prodigal son is what we see essentially right here, almost in that pure, uncompromising rushing to forgive. And it's really beautiful. And one of the things that I think is so striking, one of the reasons why Notes from Underground is so difficult, I think when we read it from this perspective that we're seeing coming out of the tradition of Roznov and of the other, the early 20th century readers of Dostoevsky who look with this religious perspective, and as we're coming from it and we see Notes, and I think we constantly see rejection and we see pushing away. And I want to read, I'm going to quote from Pope Francis here. He says, the challenge facing the Catholic imagination in our time is a challenge entrusted to you, not to explain the mystery of Christ, which is ultimately unfathomable, but to enable us to touch him and to feel his closeness, to let us see him as alive and to open our eyes to the beauty of his promises. And here's what I think is really fascinating, because something that struck me since I've started working closer and closer into the text and into the context of Notes from Underground, is that Dostoevsky wrote a letter to his brother during the process of the publication of Notes. And we remember just in general that Dostoevsky repeatedly said throughout his life that Notes is the best thing I've ever done. This is the reality of the world that we're living in now. These people, he tells us in the introduction to the text, the underground man exists and has to exist in our time. And there's so many different interpretations we can take. But then not seeing any of what we get later, not seeing any of the acceptance of that compassion, of that forgiveness, at least from the protagonist, right? But he says to his brother, I can't believe this. The swine censors let me blaspheme and let me do all this terrible stuff, and they cut out where I actually spoke of Christ. We don't have Christ in the novella, right? It's gone. And he laments
except in the reaching out and the embrace of lies. I mean, if and then isn't there speculation, correct me if I'm wrong, he could have put it back in a later edition, but he didn't.
Right.
One wonders why, where was that? But that embrace mediates Christ. I mean, Sonia more explicit. What has God ever done for you, Raskolnikov says. Very similar kind of situation, scornfully addressing the prostitute. He does everything.
Everything.
Here it's more explicit. He does everything.
Right.
And it blows away. And but I think, dang, I guess that's why when I read that too about the censor, I thought, well, it's more fully in Karamazov. We have book 6, we have book 7, we have The Dream of Cana, because I do think, and that's why I subtitled the book Finding Christ Among the Karamazovs, because I think that's finally really what he's trying to do, exactly what Pope Francis says a literary artist does at her or his best, shows us the image of Christ.
Well, I think it comes back to what we spoke about when we spoke about Alyosha in particular, but not putting it back in, leaving it as it is, allowing for what Pope Francis talks about, that mystery to be maintained. And it's a mystery not in the sense, and this is Sergei Bulgakov talks about this, of the dangers of apophaticism, right? The problem with taking the language of, it's in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, where it's inconceivable, ineffable, ever existing, all these things that surpass the rational mind, but that doesn't surpass not only artistic creation, but also that experiential quality that we have.
Right. It doesn't negate it. It may ultimately surpass it. Who knows what, the beatific vision quite well beyond anything. But it doesn't negate Dante's effort to depict it in Paradiso 33, or at the end of Karamazov in the Speech at the Stone, which I think offers an analogy for that ineffable love.
Well, and perhaps this is even where Pope Francis is angling with his love for and his desire to push Notes from Underground, is to say that even without Christ, explicitly, the image and likeness is there. The constant reminder.
I think that's it. I think that's what I discovered this morning, and it's heartbreaking. And I think, like Dostoevsky, let your heart be broken, because that's how the light gets in, to kind of bring Leonard Cohen in here a little bit. I mean, that's where, when people weep in a real way in Dostoevsky, and I'm weeping now, Dmitri says to Herzenstube, it's usually a sign that, okay, there's light coming in,
Right.
And so I sometimes resist the tragic imagination. Rowan Williams, another great commentator and great pastoral figure of our time, writes a book on Dostoevsky. But he has a book called The Tragic Imagination, and he, explains that from a Christian perspective, why that is important. And so I recommend that book as well.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, I think tragic imagination maybe is a good way to turn to. I think this is the last kind of topic that I'd like to touch on for our interview, if it's okay, unless there's anything else you want to say.
Yeah, no. Whatever comes up. That's great.
Okay. So one of the most important elements in your book, in your meeting with Pope Francis, and his words about Dostoevsky, in my estimation, are the fact that they stand as a testament to the value of Dostoevsky's work for Catholics, despite the problematic depiction of Catholicism. And you spoke about this a little bit already, but I want to maybe dig a little bit deeper, particularly in the novels, in the journalistic writings. And I'd like to quote Chloe Kitzinger from her recent piece that's on the bloggers Karamazov, which is the official blog of the North American Dostoevsky Society. I'll link to that in the description as well. But she's opening the blog's upcoming crucially important series on teaching Dostoevsky during and hopefully soon after the war against Ukraine. And Chloe writes, I'm going to quote from here a little bit at length, "Now is a complicated time to be reading, studying, and teaching the novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky. But when has teaching Dostoevsky not been complicated? Dostoevsky, purveyor of anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, xenophobia, and violent messianic Russian nationalism, has long posed a challenge to his contemporary readers who are gripped by his novels. Since Russia's escalation of its brutal war of aggression in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, this challenge looms larger." End quote. So I'd like to ask you, within the context of your meeting with the Pope, with your read, your experience throughout your life of reading Dostoevsky. It's not just now, but particularly now. What can we as readers and teachers of Dostoevsky take from Pope Francis's and your words on Dostoevsky as we're navigating this really horrific time?
So I will mention too, another person who was at that wonderful audience was Rabbi Skorza, who he had a deep friendship with. They wrote a book together, and that conversation between the rabbi and Pope Francis. The anti-Semitic strain in Dostoevsky is always a problem, and I addressed that in the discussion of Leith, when Alyosha is asked, is it true that the Jewish people have done this horrible thing they've been accused? I don't know, Alyosha says, and the reader's heart drops because you want him to say clearly, no, this is a falsehood. This is awful. But the war and Putin's use of Dostoevsky and Dostoevsky's nationalistic utterances to defend the war specifically, and I'm drawing on the article, which I will hopefully, I'll put it into your hands, Peter, but it's called Reading Dostoevsky in an Age of Putinism by George Pattison, who's one of our finest writers on Dostoevsky. He has a book coming out, a kind of creative imagining of encounters with Dostoevsky. In his Valdai conference in autumn 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin made explicit references to Dostoevsky, and he begins with those references. This is months into the war, and he made a reference, Putin, to the way Dostoevsky was being canceled, and there was a case in which a university in Milan canceled a course on Dostoevsky immediately following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it was reinstated within days after an outcry within the university and indeed globally. What he does in this article, and this is going to be really my recommending this article as the best response to Putin's use of Dostoevsky in this cynical way, is treating the issue with a great deal of complexity and nuance. For example, people will quote Dostoevsky as saying, "Oh, we should retake Constantinople," and this is the same kind of attitude that would be applied as they imagine it to a defense of what Putin is doing in Ukraine. And Pattison is saying, wait, they're not the same kinds of situations. This is a Slavic nation going against another Slavic nation and killing innocents. So when we're quick to say, or too quick to say, that Dostoevsky, in his worst utterances, his nationalistic utterances, especially in Diary of a Writer, is on the same page with Putin, it shouldn't be said. In fact, what he says toward the end is that Dostoevsky's diagnosis of nihilism in Demons could more aptly, or possibly more aptly, be applied to the kind of violence that Putin is engaged in.
Right.
That he, Dostoevsky's insight into complete cynical, nihilistic invasion, his appropriation, of course, of the Metropolitan into all of this, and suffice it to say that I recommend the article fully, and I'll quote him here. Pattison writes, "The fact that Putin himself and other Russian nationalists today appeal to Dostoevsky in support of their position cannot be allowed to decide the matter." My own view is that I continue to turn to the Brothers Karamazov, especially, as a book that nourishes the impulse for us to be in the image of Christ for each other. He's very aware, tragically, of the way we deform each other in interpersonal relationships and in the horror of war. What a deformation. But he's also offering, in the full image of the novel, the possibility of Christ-like love that, boy, the world needs to hear more than ever right now. So, you know, I hear what she's saying. There's always problematic aspects of Dostoevsky. I mean, when I get to that moment in the least in the Little Demon chapter, we have to look at that. As far as the anti-Catholicism goes, you know, people sometimes look at me and say, "Why are you so enthusiastic?" In fact, there was one reviewer. It's really funny. I'm forgetting where it was published, but he thought I might be I might be suffering from Stockholm syndrome. That is, I've been hijacked by this Orthodox nationalist who despises Catholics and despises all these others. And here I am defending him as Catholic. No, he's really actually a very Catholic vision. I still maintain that. I laughed when I read the review because I think, you know, Catholic means it runs through the whole, and there's a wholeness of vision in Dostoevsky's Christian imagination that is embracing, and that is, you know, a real power that can be employed against violence and against not seeing persons as persons. So that's the best I can do, I think, in that I mean, I know in my own heart, I'm like Alyosha in his response to Ivan. When I turn the news on and I see, I mean, especially the early days of the war, every time I turned it on, I was like Alyosha, shoot the bastard. You know, I mean, I don't want to use angry language, but that's what those stories and those images on the television elicit, that kind of bitter anger. And yet I can open up Karamazov at random and find a passage that will somehow help me to see things in the whole rather than in this one part. And I think that's where we need, you know, works of art like the Brothers Karamazov and articles like George Patterson's, which get at the complexity. This is Pope Francis's theme, not the reified, reductive, theoretical imposition, but the complexity, the way things escape our expectations and are unfinalizable, if you will. He calls it the outpouring of God's grace that just, you know, and it has real affinities, I think, to unfinalizability. Anyway, it feels more like a ramble. Maybe we're at Metropolis having one of those Russian boy conversations, I suppose. But
it's a wonderful answer. Thank you so much for it. And it reminds me that, you know, when we read these elements of Dostoevsky that are so problematic, and as you've said, finding that unfinalizable, finding the mysterious, finding Christ underneath of this. This is, I think, where we look and where we try to read when we read into Dostoevsky, teach that nuance. I'm working on some things right now, and I'm reading through Vasily Roznov and Konstantin Leontiev's correspondence about the novel. And it's shocking at times when Leontiev, who's living at Optinapustin, toward the end of his life, says that, you know, we have to teach priests to unlearn Dostoevsky, Orthodox priests, that the elders at Optina do not see themselves in Brothers Karamazov, that Leontiev thinks, and he said to the brothers, and the brothers agree with me, that the belief of the Inquisition is closer than Dostoevsky's belief. And Roznov writes in his footnotes. It's a really fascinating correspondence, and we're really lucky to have all this. But he says, at the time when they're corresponding and when Dostoevsky is writing, the Russian context, the mentality, doesn't understand what an inquisitor is, right? And doesn't have that nuance to separate out the Inquisition from the larger scheme of Catholicism, of the understanding of Christ, of the beauty of Christ. And there's this misunderstanding and that danger of going to Karamazov into it, going to heels over head, right down into the depths of humanness. And this is not to excuse any of it. Certainly, I hope that in
Right.
no way, shape, or but the reason why I bring this up too is because in my conversation with Mikhail Epstein from the previous incarnation of the series, installment of the series, we talked about in his new book, he says that one thing that we have to look at is how Dostoevsky wasn't just a prophet of the revolution of the 20th century, but how he's now become a prophet of the 21st century in Russia, at how what's happening with the ideological, as he calls it, anti-ideologies are creeping their way into the theologies in the Moscow Patriarchate. We're seeing closeness to the Grand Inquisitor. We're seeing this ideology. And so to allow ourselves to just fall into that type of reading and not to allow to use it as self-reflection, to overlook that. And
it has to be. This is right, Peter. That's the totalitarian thinking that the Inquisitor represents. Is exactly the thing Francis hates. I mean, it's ironic. The Grand Inquisitor, of course, and he makes pokes at the Jesuits. In fact, Alighieri said, "Well, this is some of the Jesuits." It's one of the places in the novel where the Jesuits take a hit. Of course, the Inquisitors are mostly Dominican, but be that as it may, it's a totalitarian imagination, and one can see it in one's own life at times. Anytime one tries to totalize and reduce and contain in a controlling manner and not respect the freedom of the person. Before this interview started, we were talking about children. Your child, who's only 6 months, will grow. Ours are 25 and 22. One learns to respect their freedom. It's not always easy. Miracle, mystery, authority, Well, let the miracles take their course. That's not under my control. And they'll find their way. But the freedom of the person is so sacred, and anything that denigrates that is totalitarian and wrong. So that's wonderful. And I wanted to mention something. When you mentioned those two figures, Rozanov, Leontiev. Do you know about this book, Lindsay Chabelos, Reading Faithfully: Russian Modernist Criticism and the Making of Dostoevsky,
yes,
1881 1917. Well, I don't have it as a book. Okay. I read it for the press, and I thought, wow, this is wonderful, because it gives us that whole period, that almost 40-year period after his death, about how he was received by various groups, and it's fascinating. So it's going to be an important book for our understanding of Dostoevsky. You've read some of it too?
I've seen a bit, yeah, and we should remember to put this in the description as well too.
Yeah. I don't even know if the book has been published yet, because I read the manuscript. I don't think she'll mind me mentioning this. I think I told her I was going to. Oh, in the conference that we had at Northwestern, I mentioned her work too in my paper. Yeah, because I was so impressed with it. Lindsay Chabelos, be on the lookout for that. Yep. Excellent. So, anything else that we didn't cover? I don't know. We covered a lot of ground, but Peter, I said before we started recording how grateful I was to you when I found a reference to your dissertation, and I needed help with the Russian in understanding what Dostoevsky meant by personhood, and we had an email back and forth, and it was just so helpful to me. And I'm so glad that a few years later we're friends working together.
It's such an honor, and it's humbling and a privilege to be able to help. And I'm so thankful to you for your incredible help with my work. And that was actually before, when you first contacted me, it was before my dissertation had been finished. And so our conversations really helped me turn the screws on a couple areas that I really needed to pay more attention to. And as I mentioned before too, you were responsible for me coming into the initiative and helping to form everything. So I'm eternally grateful and humbled for your help and your work. So thank you so much.
The feeling is mutual, Peter, and I enjoyed this conversation thoroughly. And I hope our viewers do. And if they want to email me, paul.contino@pepperdine.edu, and I'm happy always to talk about Dostoevsky or any of these matters.
Wonderful.
Or Bob that matter. There he is.
Yes. And everyone can find you through the Northwestern University
That's right.
initiative
That's right.
for the study of Russian philosophy and religious thoughts website. And
Yep.
we can hopefully have more wonderful conversations about Dostoevsky and other topics on the forum and on this channel. So thank you so much again, Paul. It's
Thank you.
wonderful speaking with you, and thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate it. We hope to see you next time. And thank you again. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.